I thought this would be an appropriate way to start our next lesson. Here we are. Dave Kemp has been so gracious to let us come onto his property where he builds log homes, and it reminded me of last week's message. If you missed it, it was about how we judge one another. Remember, they drugged the woman before Jesus, and they had such contempt for her, and they ultimately were going to condemn her. But they ended up looking foolish because Jesus said this process of judging one another is really an ugly thing that we shouldn't take part in. And we're going to segue from that because he used three illustrations, the third of which, if you remember, was the use of hyperbole by Jesus. His sense of humor is uncanny as he talked about how foolish we look when we have big logs in our own eyes as we attempt to take specks out of other people's eyes. Well, not only is that a good reminder of what he talked about, but in the lesson that he teaches now, the next lesson, wood also plays a really important role. And this time, instead of three illustrations, he uses two illustrations. And so we will take that and run with that and try to understand exactly what his point is. Now, before we get into it, I want to introduce you to a couple guys. One guy's name is Dennis, and the other guy's name is David. All right, so let's start with Dennis. Dennis is your typical guy, everyday kind of guy. The kind of guy that lives next door, the guy that you run into every day at the hardware store. Dennis graduated from Wichita State University. He was an Air Force veteran. He had a family. His family loved him. He had a good job, and he was a leader in his church. And so Dennis is somebody we want to pay attention to, and we'll get back to him later on. Also David. David and Dennis don't know each other. In fact, they have absolutely nothing in common, really. We might find something, but David is a guy living in Southern California many years ago who had the role as a pastor of an enormous church, 4,500 people. He was a well-known speaker, a world-renowned teacher, Bible teacher, and author. And so everywhere he showed up at different churches, and he came to our congregation one weekend, he was known and was loved. Now, it seems like these guys have nothing in common, doesn't it? Well, we're going to come back to them later on. They lived, and the point in their life that I want to talk about is about the same time period, the early 90s. So we'll come back to those guys in a little bit. So we're going to continue learning from Jesus' teaching. And as I've told you before, Jesus is the greatest teacher who ever lived, bar none. There's not even any competition to that, because here 2,000 years later, we hang on his every word. He's the greatest teacher ever. He's the smartest man who ever lived. But again, he's much more than that. And one of the things that I love about his teaching, there's so much to love about his teaching. But one of the things I love is that he did not teach, and he could have done this, he did not teach in a sterile environment. You know what I mean? He did not have a classroom, with fluorescent lights above and a whiteboard that he drew on, a desk. He never taught that way. In fact, most of the time, Jesus taught in the context of everyday life. Like, he might be in a place like this with his disciples, and maybe it was this kind of place that made him think of the log in our eye and the speck in other people's eyes. Well, today he's going to use a couple illustrations. We'll get back to building material eventually in the second illustration, but in the first illustration, it too is about wood. But if you remember, this whole discourse of Jesus started on a mountain, and it says they came down to a level place, and it's highly possible, if not even likely, that level place may have had an orchard. Maybe they were in an orchard, or at least maybe he could point to an orchard, because as it is here amongst the mountainous regions, there are times when orchards grow in the flat areas. So let's pick up the story there. I have a question for you. Have you ever invented a new word or a phrase? It's kind of a weird thought to think that every word we have was invented by somebody somewhere at some point in time, right? I want to invent a new word today. It's actually a derivative of a word we use all the time, but let me introduce it to you this way. When I was back in college, I hung out with a bunch of guys. They were kind of crazy guys. There were about 10 or 12 of us. And one of the things that was quirky about this group of guys, they kind of remind me of the guys in Sandlot, if you ever saw that movie, those kids that played baseball together. One of the quirky things was they would introduce new ideas or new words that I'd never heard before. For example, my buddy Stu from Dallas, he introduced the phrase, "say we dogs." Say we dogs. What does that mean? We didn't know, we just used it. We used it usually in the context of, wow, that's cool, or that's pretty neat. Hey, say we dogs, you know? It became so ingrained in us that I guarantee you all these years later, and it's been a lot of years, if you interviewed any of those guys and you said, what does this mean? They would begin to laugh, and they could tell you exactly when they became acquainted and who introduced that word to them. Okay, it became so ingrained in my life actually that when I transferred from that school in Missouri to the school in California, I took a semester off and I was a para in the public schools. I was actually a para in a 5th grade classroom. And one day the teacher said, I need to run an errand. Would you please give the kids this spelling test? They're 20 words, no big deal. They can hand it in to you. You can grade them. I trust you with the whole thing. And I said, well, thanks for trusting me. So she left. And they did the 20 words, and then I got this wild hair idea. I told the kids, now that you've finished the 20 words, I'm going to give you one more word that you've probably never heard. In fact, I guarantee you've never heard, but if you can spell it correctly, and I didn't even know how to spell it, if you can spell it correctly, I'll give you extra credit. Well, they were more than willing to try to do that. And when the teacher got back, needless to say, she was not impressed. She did not see the humor in it whatsoever. Okay, so here's the word. Are you ready? The word is obviousness. Obviousness, okay? Obviously, it's a derivative of the word obvious, but it's the word that comes to mind, like the most fitting word when we read what Jesus has to say in Luke chapter 6. And I'm going to read it to you starting in verse 43. Here we go. No good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes or grapes from briars. And he could have said, and people don't pick bananas from apple trees, right? That could have been part of the story here. And then he transitions into the human side of this. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart. And an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. All right, so it's a simple illustration, right? Whatever is inside of you, whatever is really in the genetics, the DNA of a tree, will eventually come out as evidence. It's a situation of obviousness, right? Obviousness. A banana does not grow on an apple tree. A very obvious thing. But something then that he bridges into in our human nature, he says needs to be just as obvious, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes we claim to be something, we say that we're something that we really aren't. The idea is whatever's in your heart, Jesus says, it will be revealed. That fruit will come to bear and people will know eventually. We're talking today about this gap that's between what we claim to be, who we claim to follow, what we claim is important to us, and what in reality is. And eventually, Jesus says, it'll come out. People will know by the way you talk, by the things you do. A lot of people like to say, well, you don't know what's in a person's heart. Jesus begs to differ. He says, I do know what's in a person's heart by the way they act, the way they treat people. I do know that. Do you think any of us would ever say, well, you got to be, a little easier on Adolf Hitler because he had a good heart. He just didn't understand race relations. Would you really buy that? Adolf Hitler had an evil heart. I have an evil heart. Hopefully my evil heart isn't quite as evil as his, but the reality is still the same. It's a case of obviousness is what it is, really. Now, one caveat, one disclaimer. You need to know that Jesus is not saying, he's not saying that our works earn our salvation. All right? In fact, the truth is, our faith is revealed by our actions, but it's not a way to earn that salvation. And that's a really important thing to remember. Okay, so the word for the day is obviousness, and it's pretty obvious to everybody what's in our hearts. We can conceal it for a while, but Jesus said it'll come to bear. Let's keep that in mind now. So Jesus now transitions into the second illustration he's going to use. And you're probably wondering why we're at the Black Canyon. And I'm going to tell you in a while. Let's go back to the scripture. Luke chapter 6, verse 46. Here's what he says, and this is kind of an in-your-face kind of thing that he does. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? We have a term that we use, and it's called lip service, giving lip service. And you might have thought that that started with your mom. It actually didn't. It was around the time of Jesus. It was around even before Jesus, during Isaiah's life, the prophet. Jesus, in fact, quotes him in Matthew chapter 15. He says, "You hypocrites, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." Let's go back to that question. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and yet you don't do what I say? That's a pretty penetrating question, isn't it? In the parallel version or scripture of this passage, the Message actually uses the idea of a password. Why do you use passwords to get close to me, to try to get me to do what you want me to do, Jesus says. And I love that because you and I are inundated with passwords, right? And we can easily think if I just say the right thing, then I will get what I want from God. And that's really the furthest thing from the truth. With Jesus, there are no passwords. You know, there's no secret formula thing that we got to say to get what we want is the idea. So let's go back to that penetrating question from Jesus. Why do you use all the right words, but don't do what I tell you to do? Do you have an answer for that? I mean, that question goes pretty deep. It runs pretty deep into all of our lives, doesn't it? Why do I claim to know him in the way I talk, but I just simply will not do what he tells me to do is the question. Let's go on to verse 47. As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they are like. Okay, so that's his transition into the second illustration. But look what he said. Right there is the key to everything we want to learn today. All right? Again, everyone who comes to me and puts my words into practice. This is what we sometimes call obedience to the Word of God, obedience to Jesus' words. Another way of saying it is, why don't you do my Father's will? In other words, in this series context, why aren't you about my Father's business? Doing what he wants is the question he's asking. It's a huge deal that we learn to not just say the right things, but we do the right things. John MacArthur put it this way: the faith that says but does not do is unbelief. Did you ever think about that? That maybe, just maybe, when I say all the right things, but I'm unwilling to do what Jesus told me to do, you could call that unbelief. None of us would call ourselves unbelievers, probably. But the truth of the matter is, that describes me. I say I have a relationship with Jesus, but do I really do what Jesus asked me to do? Well, let's go on in this passage in verse 48. Jesus says, here's what they're like. The people who do what I ask them to do, he says, they're like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on the rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck that house but could not shake it, because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed and its destruction was complete. Now, obviously here, the metaphor Jesus is using is that the house represents our lives. And we're going to talk more about this idea of the fact that both of these, the wise man and the foolish man, both of them heard the words of Jesus. But there was that next step that separated them. So let's talk about these storms, all right? Because in Jesus' story here, he never says, now, if a storm should come, or, you know, in the most unlikely scenario, there's a storm. He doesn't say that. He says, the storm comes. So let's talk about that for just a minute. I believe, and I want to suggest to you, that there are three kinds of storms, all right? The first one is what I'm going to call just the elements of nature storms. And this is true of in the physical sense as well as the spiritual sense. Spiritually, there's a storm in this world that's always brewing, and it's the fallenness of man. All right? And it's just the nature of us as people that we bring storms. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But I want to touch on the reality that physically, just in the physical realm of this world, those elements bring storms into our lives. In fact, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 31 promises us that this planet, this world, this earth is unraveling. It's going to pass away in its present form. Now that may come as a shock to you, especially if you believe that if you drive a certain car or if you behave in a certain way, we can save this planet. Because what Paul is saying there is, God has a design for this planet, and it's going to go away. Scientists actually have a name for this. They call it the second law of thermodynamics, or the law of entropy. And what that law states is that things wear down. They don't get better. And so this planet, this earth, this world is running down. And I'll tell you what, it's going to continue to run down no matter what we do until the moment in God's sovereign will that he says, over, enough, I'm done, and this world will burn up. Okay, so I don't want to discourage you from your green lifestyle. Go for it. If that's what you feel led to do, good for you. But I'm telling you, when God says time is up, and it will not have mattered what I did. I can't postpone that. All right, so but that's the first kind of reality of storms in our life, is that physical storms happen, tornadoes and earthquakes and different kinds of storms that come into our life and really cause havoc in us. There's another kind of storm, the second one I would draw your attention to, and that is not the elements of this world, but the enemies of this world. All right? You know that you have enemies. Jesus had enemies. I mean, the Son of God had enemies. Paul talks about the enemies that he's had. These are people, and I'll be really honest with you, I have enemies. These are people for whom they feel no problem with trying to destroy your life. Last week we talked about that judgmental process we get into and how it ends. It ends with condemnation. Remember, those guys drugged the woman caught in adultery before Jesus, and their ultimate goal was Jesus. But in the meantime, they were going to condemn her. Jesus said, where are those who wanted to condemn you? Those are enemies, people who really want your destruction. It's interesting, I look back to Sir Winston Churchill, and there's some great stories about people in his life and some enemies he had. He had this one lady in his life that just hated him. And she at one point said to him, Sir Churchill, she said, if you were my husband, I would give you poison to drink. Can you imagine someone actually saying that to your face? But his response was classic. He said, ma'am, he said, if you were my wife, I would drink that poison. So we have enemies. We could go on all day about that. But there's the elements of nature of this world. There are just enemies that we're going to have throughout this life. But third, the kind of storms that we tend to have are just the things that come into our life because of our everyday decisions and choices. Paul wrote about this in Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. He said, you can't mock God on this. You can't make fun of God. The way it is set up is that we will reap what we sow. In other words, when I sow poor choices and poor decisions in life, storms will come. And we see this all around us, right? A lot of the things in our life that are destructive are just the natural flow of life that happens when we make really poor choices. I want to say one more thing, and someone wrote this the other day, and I really liked it. We're in a storm right now. We're all in the same storm, right? This coronavirus is a storm that this whole world is a part of. And someone said this, I really agree with them. To say that we're all in the same boat is a misnomer. And that's mislabeling what's going on. We have different boats that we're all riding in through this storm. For example, the boat that I'm in, to be honest with you, during this stormy time of the coronavirus, I'm actually enjoying it. I'm enjoying the downtime. I'm enjoying time to write, to read, to pray, to spend time going on walks with my wife. And I don't know if that's illegal right now or not, but we do that. Just letting the cat out of the bag. I enjoy the time to play card games with my kids and hang around with my grandkids. I'm enjoying it. But see, that's probably not your boat. You probably are in a different boat. You're probably in a boat where maybe you're experiencing incredible loneliness and solitude that you would never invite into your life. You may be locked down. I know some of you, I've talked to you. You're actually locked down in the place where you live. And it's a lonely time. You actually may be experiencing illness. The boat you're in is not pleasant. Same storm, different boat, right? And in the general sense, honestly, I can't tell you that I can empathize with the boat and the storm you're a part of. I've not battled cancer. I've not lost a child. I have not lost my job. But many of you, most of you have. So we have these storms and we all are in different boats. But the bottom line is this is just a reality of life. All right? And so for us to be shocked by storms would be for us to not believe that Jesus tells the truth about this life. Okay, let's talk, we talked storms, let's talk foundation. Okay, because this story, when it comes down to, the essence of it is about foundation. The wise man built his house, his life, on a solid foundation. The foolish man built his house on really no foundation at all. What is Jesus talking about? This is really, really important here because Jesus does not say that the wise man is a guy who builds his life on traditions, on church attendance, on morality, right? None of those things. In fact, I'm going to shock you with something, and I don't want you to turn off the video, right yet, because I want to tell you something that just occurred to me this week. Jesus did not even say that he built his house on Jesus. He didn't say that. Now, why didn't he say that? Because we all know the rock is Jesus, right? He is the cornerstone of our faith. But in the story, he does not say that man built his house on Jesus. What did he say specifically? He built his house, he built his life on practicing my words. Now, I got to be honest with you. I wish he would have just said, build your life on Jesus. We've all said that. We've all thought that. We've all told somebody that, right? Just build your life on Jesus. The problem with that is it is so vague, right? It is so ambiguous because for you to build your life on Jesus may look one way. For me to build my life on Jesus may look another way. The concept of Jesus, a man who lived 2,000 years ago, can vary from person to person, tradition to tradition, church to church, denomination to denomination. Jesus took all the guesswork out of it. That's what I want you to see here. Build your house on my words, not just on believing my words, but on practicing my words. He gets so specific, it's actually painful. Now, why is this a big deal? Let me tell you a story. Hopefully it'll help with this idea. There's a story that's been around for a long time, and it was some time ago, not recently, where there was a modern Indian tribe with a chief who was, a modern guy, and he did not have what his forefathers had, and that was the ability to look at the sky and look at, things around him and determine what the winter would be like. So one fall, his people came to him and they asked him as the chief. They said, so what kind of winter will we be facing? Because that's what a chief is supposed to know, I guess. I don't know. So as the story goes, he looks at them and he says, I think it's going to be And he really didn't know. He said, I think it's going to be kind of a tough winter. We should probably gather some wood. And so they went about their business. But he got to thinking, what if I misled them? And so he actually, in this story anyway, he goes to a phone and he calls the National Weather Service, all right? And he gets the guy that always answers the phone, and he tells him, he says, hey, I was just wondering, ask him this question, I was just wondering what kind of winter you guys are forecasting. And the guy said, we think it's going to be kind of a hard, cold winter, maybe a long winter. And he said, really? Okay, well, fine, thank you. And he hung up, and he went back to his people, and he gathered them again. And with that bit of information, he now felt really confident. And he said, it really is. I've looked at things. It really is going to be a tough, tough winter. So I want you to go gather more wood. And so they went about doing that. Some time went by, maybe a week or two, and he started to have doubts again. Is it really going to be this? So a couple more times he called the National Weather Service, talked to the same guy, asked him the same question, and the guy kept saying, yeah, our forecast is for a long, difficult winter. And so the chief would go back again and tell his people, hey, let's gather more wood, all right? One last time he thought, I want to make for sure that we are doing the right thing, that I don't look foolish. He calls the guy and he's asking him one more time, is it really going to be a long, hard winter? And the guy this time says, all I can tell you is this, we're watching the Indians and they are gathering wood like crazy. Okay, I like the story. Okay, that story, in case you're getting nervous about political incorrectness, which is I usually do have a problem with, it's not about Native Americans. It's not about the National Weather Service. That story is about human nature. Humanity tends to look to one another for absolute truth. And the truth of the matter is, most of the time, if we're honest, we're making stuff up. I mean, we really are. We're just kind of doing our best to figure things out as they come along because we're not all knowing. And we see this throughout history. We see it all the time in our culture. In 1899, the director of the Office of Patents turned to President McKinley and he told him, he said, I believe everything that's going to be invented has already been invented. Talk about making stuff up, right? He had no idea, but he spoke as though he had some kind of authority. In 1958, Thomas J. Watson, who was the CEO of IBM, made this statement. He said, my perspective is that there's only a market for about 5 computers in the entire world. Okay, so, and these are the experts. And we've seen this in this storm that we're in the middle of, right? This virus. If you've been paying attention, have you not noticed how the target is always moving, right? I mean, it's just kind of fluid. We look to the government, we look to organizations to give us absolute facts, absolute truth, and they are not able. I mean, first it was millions will die in our country, then it was hundreds of thousands will die. Now we're down to, tens of thousands maybe, not sure. First it was you won't need masks, now you need masks. Now it's illegal not to have a mask, and you got to have a fashionable mask. I don't know, the thing just keeps moving. You got to be 6 feet apart. Well, as long as they don't sneeze on you, don't cough on you. Oh no, now it's airborne. It is so confusing. Sometimes we drive up to a drive-through window to get something to eat, and the people are wearing hazmat suits. Other times they just came off the beach, hardly wearing anything. It's crazy. Christy and I, we went to California just right before this mandated shutdown, all right? In fact, the mandated shutdown came while we were there, and we got home to get it shut down. But while we were there, we figured on the way we were concerned about gas. Will they shut down gas stations? They'd been shutting down everything else, restaurants, all those kinds of things. Will they shut down gas stations? And we talked a lot about this. What we didn't realize is that's not what our concern should have been. The concern was there's plenty of gas stations. The concern is, are there bathrooms? We drove to California, to Southern California. Are there bathrooms? And the answer is no. there really aren't. The rest stops were locked up. All the restaurants, you couldn't go in. The fast food, you couldn't go in. Your only shot was a gas station, and sometimes that was hit and miss. That became the pressing matter for us in our trip to California. We actually got into Southern California, and we were planning these bathroom stops, really, calculating them very, particularly carefully. And we were at the end of our rope, as far as, needing to use a facility. Christy found a Sam's Club. And we both went, Sam's Club! They've got great bathrooms. They're some of my favorite public bathrooms. So we made our way off the freeway and got to this, 5 minutes off the freeway, got to the Sam's Club. We got out. We're hustling over there because we need to get in there pretty quick. I pull out my Sam's card, club card to, show them so there won't be any hesitation. We walk up to the front of the store, and there are about 60 people in line. They're doing the whole, there's too many people in there, you got to wait in line. That had to have been a half-hour wait. We looked at each other with the greatest sense of panic I think we've ever had. Like, what now? See, it's a fluid situation. When we left, that wasn't happening. Nobody was making people line up outside stores. The point is this: even in the midst of this interesting time, the truth, what keeps moving? The reality, what's against the law, what's within the law, we don't know. And so for us to pretend like the government, like the media, like celebrities are going to give us absolute truth, they're not. They can't. They'll pretend to, of course. There is only one who is truth and always spoke truth. It never said a word that wasn't absolutely true. His truth does not change. 2,000 years later, what he said was true, and it still is true. So the question remains for us. So why don't we practice those words? Can you imagine if we put as much time and effort and energy into practicing what Jesus said as we do to practicing social distancing and stay home, save a life? Can you imagine the kind of people we would become? I'm not mocking what's going on right now, really. I'd like to, but I'm not going to. I'm simply bringing you back to what Jesus said. Practice my words. These will never change. They will always be true. Okay, so we've talked storms and we've talked foundation. Now we get to the part that we really need to understand, and we're going to call it the gap. And the gap is the reason we're here at the Black Canyon. If you're watching this and you've never been here, this is an amazing place just outside of Montrose, not maybe 10 miles outside of Montrose. And it is amazing because it is so deep that there are places there in the bottom where the Gunnison River flows where for only 33 minutes a day does it see sunlight. In fact, several miles behind me is a sheer wall called Painted Wall, and that wall is the deepest wall in Colorado. It extends 2,250 feet down to where the river is. It's an amazing place. Places like this and that one other hole in Arizona, it escapes me the name of that place. They remind me of the gap in life. There's an enormous gap between here and the walls facing us right now. But there is a gap in life that is so much greater. And I want to bring it to you through a quote by a guy by the name of Dick Biggs. And what Biggs says is, he says, the greatest gap in life is the one between knowing and doing. And the truth of the matter is, when Jesus was here, he was around a lot of religious experts that knew it all, but they didn't know how to do it. They didn't know how to do what God wanted them to do. And they lived in that gap. We've been talking about pioneers and settlers. Settlers become very comfortable in that gap, in that place of, I know a lot, and over here is doing, and I think I'll just hang out between. I'm not going to go all the way to doing what I know about Jesus. And that's what I believe this story is really about, because he says it is the man not who just hears, meaning hears and knows now, is knowledgeable about my words, but it's the man who knows, hears, and does, and practices what I've given them to do, who will have a foundation in which the storms of life cannot destroy them, is what he's saying. I want to go back to Matthew chapter 23, and it says that Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees are the official interpreters of the law of Moses, meaning they know it all. So practice and obey whatever they tell you. But, watch this, don't follow their example. And he ends it this way, for they do not practice what they preach. Listen to that last line. What an indictment. They do not practice what they teach, what they preach, what they say. They say they know everything, and they do know everything, Jesus says. So listen to them, but don't follow them. That's a scary thing. So wonder Jesus had a real problem with those guys. I mean, the things he called them a nest of snakes. He called them a gravestone with just dead bones underneath, right? We were at the cemetery a couple of weeks ago, and it can be beautiful on the surface, and that was his point. You guys look great. I mean, wow. You know, the robes, the hats, the tassels, the little box on your forehead. You look great. You say some great things, is his point. But beneath the surface, he says, you are full of dead man's bones. That's a little scary to have the Son of God say that about you. But that's what he was talking about. Now, why would he say that? The gap. Living in the gap is a dangerous place to live. We best not ever settle in there, is the point. Now, in terms of this conversation about the gap, there is a caveat that we need to touch on before we wrap this up. And the caveat is this, and you may be ahead of me, but Steve, even the Apostle Paul admitted to living in the in the gap. And so I want to read exactly what he said about life in the gap. It comes from Romans chapter 7, and it sounds a little bit like Dr. Seuss. In fact, I wonder if Dr. Seuss got his style from Paul. I don't know, but here we go, verse 15. I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. As it is no longer I myself who do it, but it is sin living in me. For I know that good itself does not dwell in me. That is in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do. This I keep on doing. Now, if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but the sin that is living in me that does it. Okay, I want to make a quick comment, and then I want to show you the last line of this. Can you relate to Paul? I think you can. We all can. He's describing life in the gap. Here's what I say I believe. Here's what I say I want to do. I know I should do, but I don't do it. I don't actually live the words of Jesus like I want to. But the difference is here, and it may seem slight, but it's an enormous difference. Look at verse 24 of Romans chapter 7. What a wretched man I am. Do you hear the frustration? Do you hear just the tension for him? Now here's the difference. For most of us, quite honestly, we get used to life in the gap and we settle in. That's what the religious leaders had done. They knew all about God, but they didn't want to do what God asked them to do. But they settled there, and it became a way of life. And we do the same thing, don't we? We settle in there, and we just say, oh, well, I'm saved by grace. This is not about salvation. That's a done deal through the blood of Christ. Now it's about living out that salvation in a way that pleases him, honors him, benefits his kingdom. Okay, so this is a huge deal. Because if we settle in, we become the kind of people that start to have a negative, catastrophic, if you will, effect on others. In the 13 years that we were in youth ministry, we knew literally thousands of kids, and the ones that left the faith, they almost had the same story. over and over again. One common denominator when you talk to them. They would say, my parents are hypocrites. My parents claim to believe one thing. They pretend to act a certain way around other people, around Christians. But at home, we see the real thing. Doesn't it remind you what Jesus said about the fruit? Out of the heart, eventually, the evidence will be there. And for those kids, the evidence was there about the reality of their parents. And then it affected their lives. A sad, dangerous place to live. But see, the difference is Paul was not satisfied in the gap. You see that frustration. I'm not satisfied. I'm going to pioneer through it is the idea. I will never be okay with living in that place. Okay, so we started with, I introduced a couple guys to you, Dennis and David. Let's talk about them as we wrap up. Dennis, his full name is Dennis Lynn Rader. He is also known by the phrase, the BTK Strangler. In fact, he gave that name to himself. He lived in Wichita, and over a matter of years, from 1974 to 1991, he murdered at least 10 people. Unbeknownst to his wife, his kids who adored him, his co-workers, his church. He was a leader in the church. So what was going on with Mr. Rader? He was living in the gap. He was living between what he claimed to be and the reality of his life, and he was satisfied there. I talked to you about a guy named David. David came to our congregation in the early 90s, and he spoke to a huge crowd, thousands of people, and he spoke on purity, specifically sexual purity. And it was a great weekend. Unfortunately, this guy, who was a pastor of like 4,500 people in Southern California, famous writer, famous speaker, world-renowned, biblical author, unfortunately, a couple months later, it was discovered that he was having an affair with a woman in his church at the very time he was speaking to our congregation. What's going on there? Life in the gap. Life in the gap. We learn how to manage our image and hide the fact that what I claim and what I really live are two different things. And I just learned to live there, and I become very satisfied there. I settle in there. This discussion about pioneering and settling, boy, it is where the rubber meets the road now, right? To be a pioneer is to say, I am never going to settle for living in that gap. Now, there was a question years ago that was raised, and it became a very popular question, and I want to raise it again today. And in the question, the word Christian is used. I'm going to change that because, as you know by now, and many of our conversations, I think the term Christian doesn't really mean much, if anything, anymore. So I'll change that part of it, but the rest of it, I want to give to you. And here's the question. If you were on trial for being a follower of Jesus, would there be enough evidence to convict you? That's a tough question, isn't it? So let's say, I don't want to settle here anymore. I want to be a pioneer. But how do we get from here to the other side of this chasm? Let's start with this, and I want to wrap it up with this. Remember the old movie, What About Bob? His psychiatrist, trying to help Bob make major change in his life. And he said, I'll tell you what, Bob, let's start with baby steps. I love that. Baby steps. Let's us start with baby steps. Honestly, how can I practice the words of Jesus? How can I make that my life if I don't even know the words of Jesus? Do you know the words of Jesus? Do you know the commands of Jesus? Do you know what Jesus thought on any given topic? He talked about everything. The time in which we live, the panic in which we live right now. He addressed that kind of time. He didn't say anything about this virus, but he certainly addressed the kinds of things that are going on right now. Do you know what he said? So before you can ever expect to jump the chasm here, let's start with that very simple baby step. Will you spend the time here during this downtime, establish a habit of coming to understand the words of Jesus? At least know what they are. Know what he had to say about any given topic. And then you could begin the process of growing towards a life of practicing his words. Why? Not because it earns you salvation. That's a done deal. But because He wants the best for you, and he promised you that if you're going to endure the storms, in fact, if you have the chance to thrive in the storms, make sure that your life is not devastated by the storms of life. It will only be through the life of practicing his words. So that's the challenge, church. Will you take advantage of this time we have? Develop a new habit? I pray you will. We miss you. Stay strong in him. He is our strength.